Stroudsburg University, and of course she's a doctoral student in our exercise physiology program. She's going to be presenting essentially a pre-proposal for what hopefully will be her dissertation proposal here later this semester. So it's a nice dry run and to get some feedback from you on this topic. So with that, Ashley, the floor is yours.
Alright, so like Dr. Abel said, I'm going to go through kind of a pre-proposal for my idea for my dissertation. So we're going to talk about the effect of external stressors on firefighter performance. And we're going to go through an introduction to introduce you guys to the idea. So we're going to talk about PPE or personal protective equipment that firefighters have to wear. And we're going to talk about the load carriage effect as well as the thermal regulation effect that this equipment has on their performance. We're going to talk about the SCBA, or the self-contained breathing apparatus, which is another part of their required equipment and that effect on their performance. And then we're going to talk about the physical fitness characteristics that are required to perform well through a variety of tasks. So we're going to walk through the literature and talk about what we do know, and then what the gaps are in the literature, so what we don't know. And we'll move on to my pre-proposal, the purpose of it, the methodology, and then the significance of the results that we hope to find. So to just give you an idea of what firefighters are required to wear when they're responding to calls. So here are different views of somebody dressed in full gear. They call it turnout gear. So I put the numbers up here. There are boots, helmet, the breathing apparatus, or the SCBA. All in total weigh about 20 kilograms or over 40 pounds. And it depends on, the numbers vary about where you look, but you're talking between 40 to 50 pounds of extra weight, and that's not including any equipment they have to carry. So when you talk about the load carriage effect of the personal protective equipment, there's several biomechanical limitations. So different studies have shown gait alterations when wearing this gear because they have a limited joint range of motion, decreased mobility, and the impingement from the load carriage also tends to modify posture and balance. And when you're talking about load carriage, it's not just the weight, but the placement of the load you're wearing matters. So there was a study done by Taylor and colleagues, and they had 6 different conditions across. Some subjects wore boots, some just wore the jacket, the pants, the SCBA, and they tried seeing what had the greatest metabolic burden. And they found that boots actually had the greatest metabolic burden during walking and stepping compared to any of the other load carriage. And this was in both absolute and relative terms. So when they express it per kilogram of load carried, the boots had an 8.7 times greater effect than carrying the SCBA, which, if you remember, was about 3 or 4 times as heavy. So when you're looking further about the weight effect of load carriage, there's been several studies done on obstacle course performance and walking protocols to see what kind of decrement there is in performance. So another article by Taylor found that on average, firefighters had a decreased performance of 27% while wearing full turnout gear. So this is about 20 kgs. There's been a variety of other studies done in other tactical populations because this is a population you tend to see a lot of load carriage. So in military walking protocols, wearing a little heavier gear, so 25 kilograms and almost 40 kilograms, they also found there was an increased metabolic load, mechanical work, and energy costs compared to their control. And I put a study here that looked at military obstacle performance, and this was a much shorter study, so you can see it only took them about 30 seconds to complete their obstacle course performance when they were unloaded, and their performance decreased by 31%, so to about 35 seconds when they were loaded. And this is wearing a much heavier load, about 40 kgs. But the reason this is a relevant study is their obstacle course consisted of them starting prone. They had to get up, run 30 meters, sprint 27 meters zigzag, and then drag a 79 kilogram dummy for a victim rescue. Victim rescue, as you'll see, is a common obstacle course or task that is often required from firefighters. Thomas actually did his master's work on putting SWAT through an obstacle course, and he found a similar pattern that performance decreased by almost 8% when they were wearing a 14.2 kilogram load. So this is less than what firefighters would wear, and this was a longer obstacle course, so 190 seconds, so a little over 3 minutes unloaded, jumped up to 206 seconds when they were loaded. And he also had a victim drag in his, and he found that performance on that decreased by 15%. So when you move on to the thermal regulation part of wearing the PPE, it's kind of a two-part dilemma, because obviously when the firefighters are in like a structure fire, you have high ambient temperatures working against you of a couple hundred degrees, but even if they're just on scene and not actually in a high ambient environment, there's still a microclimate that's created from wearing the PPE. So especially if they're exercising at a high level, they're creating a high heat production, and this gear doesn't allow them to dissipate heat. And this can lead to a variety of things. Dehydration because of the increased heat stress, which can lead to early fatigue, a decrease in performance, and some research has come out saying this is probably related to the risk of having a sudden cardiac event. So there was a study done by Larson and colleagues that looked at high ambient temperatures in wildland firefighting. So this is different than structural firefighting, which is what we normally think of when we think of firefighters. They looked at the impact of very hot conditions on the work performance and the responses to a manual handling task compared to the same work in a temperate environment. So their control was about 65 degrees, so room temperature for us, and their very hot temperature was about 113 degrees, which is probably like simulating a wildland fire, but a structural firefighter, they would be in there, it would be a couple hundred degrees in the building, so it's not nearly as hot. They conducted a 3-hour protocol. So they had 4 1-minute bouts of raking debris, 2 8-minute bouts of stepping, and then they had 2 20-minute bouts of resting. So they found in the results that in the very hot temperatures, the firefighters were less efficient. They raked 19% less debris. Their core temperature was almost a degree higher, and their skin temperature was about 5.5 degrees higher in the very hot conditions. They had an increased heart rate of almost, it was 22 beats per minute higher than in the control condition. They were allowed to consume water freely, so they consumed almost 3 liters more water during a very hot condition compared to the regular condition. And this resulted in a higher sweat loss. However, they took urine-specific gravity and found that in both trials, the subjects were hydrated at the end of the trial, so they managed to drink enough water freely to make up for their increased sweat loss. They also found an increased thermal sensation and higher RPE. So their RPE on average was almost 16 compared to around 13 for the control condition, and their thermal sensation was about 6.5 compared to 4.5 in the control condition. So here are some graphs that they had from their study, and they broke their protocol into 3 hours, so that would be T1, T2, T3. And over here you can see core temperature started to increase, especially in the later 2 hours, so that's when it was significantly different. It was significantly different in time point 1, but you can see the major increase started after an extended period of time. This is their heart rate during the different work bouts. So you can see right away there was an increased heart rate, increased RPE, increased thermal sensation in the very hot conditions compared to the control condition. And here's their heart rate during their rest period. So you can see that even when they were allowed to rest, and during their rest they were allowed to take their jacket and their helmet off, their heart rate's still elevated as a thermal response to the effect of the microclimate of the PPE.
Actually, can you please tell me what the P core temperature was on that slide? I just can't see it.
Where are you?
The last time point in core temperature, figure A.
It's about like 38.5 up there.
Thank you.
So another study that looked at the microclimate of the turnout gear was Smith and colleagues, and they compared 3 different conditions in a walking protocol. So they were looking at the effects of dehydration. So their conditions were hydrated with heat stress, hydrated with no heat stress, and dehydrated with heat stress. So they considered heat stress when their subjects wore their turnout gear, which was about 41 pounds. And in their no heat stress condition, they wore 41.2 pounds of load carriage still, but they wore a cooling shirt, they carried an SCBA, and had a weighted vest. So they had a walking protocol. It's 100 minutes, and they would walk for 20 minutes and then had a 20-minute rest bout. And it was a pretty moderate intensity, 3.1 miles per hour at 5% grade. So they found that in all the conditions, core temperature rose during exercise and into 2 minutes of recovery and then began to decline. In the hydrated, no heat stress condition, core temperature only increased by about 1 degree Celsius between the start and the end of the whole protocol. The hydrated heat stress condition increased by 2.2 degrees, and the dehydrated heat stress condition increased by 2.7. So that's a 2 times increase just by adding the effect of wearing the PPE in a temperate environment. This graph is looking at the heart rate response during exercise. So heart rate averaged 105 beats per minute in the no heat stress condition, but jumped up to 152 beats per minute in the heat stress hydrated condition and 158 in the dehydrated heat stress. So their takeaway point was that there's obviously a large increase in cardiac strain occurring here just due to the microclimate and the effect of the PPE. So even if you look through these conditions, so this is exercise, recovery, in these heat conditions, their recovery heart rate is in the first few minutes approaching just the work heart rate during the no heat stress condition. So it's a pretty big difference. All right, so moving on from the turnout gear and more into the SCBA. So this is a picture of the self-contained breathing apparatus. So it's this part here. And this is probably the most debilitating part in the research that has been shown. It provides protection from smoke and ash. And contrary to what you might think, or at least what I thought, it's not difficult for the firefighters to breathe in air. It's actually hard for them to breathe out. So they're breathing in oxygen from a tank, but they have to breathe out against enough resistance for that air like clear through the line. So they can breathe in, but they have to, it'd be like breathing out through a straw. Like you have to push against a certain amount of external resistance. So this results in an increased work of breathing, an increased expiratory pressure to overcome increased active expiratory resistant work and inspiratory elastic work. And some studies have looked into if this is a result of limited chest wall mechanics from the hardness of the SCBA and the weight of it. But overall, the SCBA has shown decreased performance. There's an increased sensation of breathlessness, lung hyperinflation, and now you have an increased competition between your respiratory muscles and your exercising muscles for blood flow, which results in an increased competition for your available cardiac output, ultimately leading to a reduction in blood flow to your active muscles and an earlier onset muscle fatigue. So Eves looked at a study where they had 4 conditions and they ran their subjects through graded exercise tests. And their conditions were their control, where they just had the regular mask on, so a low resistance valve, no cylinder. They had a full SCBA trial, so they had the regulator and the pack on. They had a pack trial where they just had the pack on, so essentially looking at the impact of the harness and the weight, but not breathing through the regulator. And then the last condition was breathing through the regulator without the weight or the mechanics of the pack on. So they found that there was a total decrease in VO2 max by almost 15% when wearing the full SCBA, and their maximum power output decreased by almost 12%. And this was about 12 kilograms between the regulator and the pack. When they took out the weight of the pack, they found that VO2 max was still decreased by 13%. So this seems to be contributing more than anything that has to do with the weight or the mechanics of the harness on the pack. And the pack alone without the regulator decreased VO2 max by almost 5%, and that weighed about 11 kilograms. They also found an altered breathing pattern, which we'll look at in the next slide. And this was pretty interesting. They found an inverse relationship between the change in ventilation and absolute VO2 max. So in this top graph, these are just individual responses between the control condition and the full SCBA. So you can see some people aren't really affected. This is ventilation. Some people don't have much of a difference. And then you look at some people like this, where their ventilation drops an extreme amount when they put the SCBA on. So there's a lot of individual responses. But this graph looked at absolute VO2 max compared to the change in ventilation. And as you can see, people that had a lower absolute VO2 max had a much higher change in their maximum ventilation, which suggested that cardiovascular fitness probably plays a large role in the decrement in performance seen because of the regulator. So these graphs looked at the effect of the respirator on power output and ventilatory parameters. So you can see up until about 240 watts, there was a similar breathing pattern seen between the control and the SCBA. At lower ventilation rates, there's a slightly higher tidal volume and a lower breathing frequency. And at higher ventilation rates, you see a lower tidal volume, but breathing frequency was not significantly changed. And duty cycle, which is inspiratory time over total time, was greatly reduced above 80 liters per minute for ventilation. But you can see here, this is the control, this is the SCBA, that things start to significantly change in duty cycle as you increase your ventilation. So the authors suggest this is probably due to a decrease in inspiratory time as well as the increase in expiratory time. And in all these graphs, you can see that they reached a lower power output at maximum effort. From the same article, they found that expiratory flow wasn't significantly different until near maximal exercise. However, at ventilations above 80 liters per minute, the estimated breathing resistance and expiratory pressure was elevated with SCBA. So your expiratory pressure is over here. You can see it starts to increase, and external breathing resistance as well. So moving on to the fitness characteristics that perhaps play a role in all these things, like any athletic sport, you can really break this down to a strength and cardiovascular component. And obviously, there has to be a minimal level of absolute strength here because their equipment weighs a certain amount and their PPE is 40 pounds. However, muscular endurance has also been shown to be a factor in the Firefighter test, which we'll talk about later. And the cardiovascular component, in the literature, there seems to be an agreement that 45 milliliters per kg is the criteria measure for a minimal level of fitness required. And a couple studies have shown during their obstacle course or firefighter work tasks that most of the tasks are correlated with VO2 max. This study was done in Nova year, and it had these are the components of the test. So cutting, climbing upstairs, pulling a hose, demolition, rescue, entering the vehicle, and then entering. So there's two studies I want to go over that looked at the relationship between fitness characteristics and firefighter ability test. So this first one was done by ladies. They did not wear gear in their ability test. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're going over this. But their fitness test looked at abdominal strength, anaerobic power. They used a vertical jump and a step test to calculate anaerobic power, muscular endurance. They did maximal push-ups and the amount of sit-ups in 1 minute. They found grip strength. They used a 1RM bench and squat for their muscular strength, sit and reach for flexibility, and they also found body composition. And their test took about 7 minutes. They had a stair climb, they had to lift and move a roll hose, do a Kaiser sled, a hose pool, and then a hydrant hookup. Once again, a rescue drive, and a charge to hose advance. So in the parentheses, I just put the amount of time each of these components took, so you guys had an idea of how long the course was. So their results were that 71% of the variation in the ability test performance could be explained by different fitness parameters. Their final regression ended up reducing this to 5 variables, which accounted for 60% of the variation. And their variables were resting heart rate, body fat percentage, abdominal strength, push-ups, and power calculated from the minute step test. So the next study we'll talk about was done by Ray and colleagues. So their fitness test was a little different. They used the Cooper 12-minute run to calculate cardiovascular endurance. And if you notice, the other test didn't look at VO2 max at all. They used an anaerobic power endurance test of a 400-meter sprint, 5 RM bench and squat, and hand grip for muscular strength. And then for muscular endurance, they did bench, row, bicep curls, and shoulder press max reps. Hand grip, they used an isometric, and they had to hold on as long as they could until it dropped below 25 kgs. And then they did abdominal muscular endurance as well. They also found body composition, and they ended up with a combined fitness score. So they added up all of the measures from all their tests and just gave them one score. Their FireFit test, this time they wore the turnout clothing, so they had the harness and the weight of the SCBA, but they weren't actually wearing a regulator. This was a little shorter, so they had a hose pull, a stair climb, a victim drag, and equipment hoist. And they only took about between 20 to 80 seconds per obstacle. However, they were allowed to rest for at least 10 minutes in between each task because they wanted to minimize the effective fatigue on each of the individual tasks. So their results show that overall task performance was correlated with muscular strength, endurance, and anaerobic endurance. Their overall fitness score correlated to their performance total and individually to 3 of the 4 tasks. Bench press, hand grip, and hand grip strength correlated with all the tasks. And muscular endurance for row, shoulder press, and bicep curl correlated with all the tasks, as well as the 400-meter run. They didn't find that the 12-minute run and the body fat were correlated at all, which wasn't really surprising because they were allowed to rest 10 minutes in between each task, which kind of eliminated any cardiovascular component. And the authors recognized this and said that, according to them, like, it was pretty clear that cardiovascular fitness had a role in firefighter performance, and they just wanted to look at the individual tasks and the individual characteristics of these tasks. So now when we look about, like, we've gone through the literature and think about what we know, firefighting is obviously a pretty challenging profession. It involves a lot of heavy lifting. There's prolonged periods of stress and exertion, and studies have shown that this can lead to decreased cognitive function, judgment, and accuracy, which is obviously not something that we really want when we're in a life or death situation. They have high heart rates for prolonged periods, which can stress a cardiovascular system, especially one that's already weak. And unlike the luxury of any of us athletes, they're not allowed to have a warm-up or rest times, and they don't get water breaks as in like a scheduled match. So their fitness levels can influence their success and safety to a great extent. When you just kind of go through literature, so on average during a call, they're working at about 62% of their VO2 max. Others say just standard 40 to 45 milliliters per kg or 12 meds. But either way, they're pretty close to their maximal heart rate for an extended duration of time. And as a public safety job, they need to have minimum fitness standards that avoid injury to themselves or injuries to others, but you also can't have it be discriminatory, so it needs to be scientifically backed. And when we look at all this, there obviously having like high stress situations. They also have a stressful lifestyle, so their sleep habits are weird. And these are all risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And between 1995 and 2004, almost half of on-duty deaths were caused from sudden cardiac death. So not only do we want to make them more fit so that their performance increases, but if we can make them more fit so that they're working at a lower relative intensity when they have to perform all these tasks, hopefully we see a lesser decrement in cognitive function, judgment, accuracy. We're not putting as much stress on their system, and hopefully we can minimize the risk of self-injury and injuries to others. So I found this quote from a review article that just was released in July about the effect of load carriage. And they were talking about how, I highlighted the important things, but the important thing here is that research should be focused on the development of new screening and cut scores that should lead to reflection on and reevaluation of the relevance of the existing tests and standards for occupation in which load carriage is obligatory. So basically they're saying it's very unlikely that an accurate evaluation of someone's loaded working capacity is possible when evaluation in an unloaded state. So when you look back at some of the articles I went over, we were comparing fitness characteristics, but they went through their obstacle course unloaded, which is pretty unrealistic. So what we don't really know is what decrement in performance is individually caused by the PPE and the SCBA during a simulated fireground test, and if different fitness characteristics are related to these decrement in performances due to the equipment. So here I have the full gear, just the load carriage, thermal regulation aspect, and then the regulator. So to talk about my proposed study, the purpose of the study would be to determine the decrement in performance caused by the individual components of firefighter personal protective equipment, the SCBA, and load carriage. So a secondary aim of the study is to determine the relationship between various fitness characteristics and the potential decrement performance seen on a simulated fireground test in different conditions. So here are the hypotheses for my study. I think that PPE and SCBA will produce a significant performance decrement in occupational performance. I think that the combined condition will produce the greatest decrement in occupational performance. And based on some of the research, I think that fatigue index, lean body mass, muscular endurance, and aerobic fitness will be associated with the load carriage induced performance decrement. So this would be the condition without the SCBA, and that aerobic fitness will be most strongly associated with SCBA induced performance decrement. So the study is a randomized crossover design with a convenience sample. So it would be about 25 recruits from the Lexington Fire Department Training Academy, and they'd be about 10 weeks into the academy around the time of this event. There'd be 4 test sessions of a simulated fireground test. We would look at body composition, so height, body mass, whole body DIA, and then they conduct fitness testing in the academy. They do 2-minute push-ups, 2-minute pull-ups, sit-ups, and a 1.5 mile run. And in the parentheses here, I just put what their minimum and maximum standards are while in the academy. And we'd also like to add in a wind gate, a vertical jump, and look at hand grip strength. So the simulated fireground test will be developed working with the training officer through the Lexington Fire Department. But based on previous research, it'll probably include a stair climb, a fire hose drag, an equipment carry, ladder raise, a forcible entry simulated by the Kaiser force machine, a search, and a rescue. So I put the weight of all of these things next to the components, so you can see they're pretty heavy. And I have a video of the Kaiser force machine in case you guys know what that is. It's not working. Alright. Well,
Because we toggled into this notes view thing, isn't it?
probably.
Oh, So at the end, you can close out of maybe your presentation and just come back and show this video.
Okay. So these are the three conditions for my proposed study. So they would run through the fire ground test in PT clothes, and that would be their control condition. They'd run through it in their gear without wearing the respirator, so no SCBA. And this is going to give us the load carriage and microclimate effect of the PPE. And their third condition would be full turnout gear, so SCBA and PPE. So they'll have 2 familiarization trials. Potentially they can run through these on the same day to get used to the test and figure out their pacing. The conditions will be in a randomized order. We'll take lactate pre and post test. We'll look at urine-specific gravity to check dehydration levels before and after, and pre-post weight to check for sweat loss and see if there's differences between trials. And during the trials, we'll be taking heart rate, RPE, and have them throw on the omega wave for heart rate variability upon completion of the trial. So this slide just kind of shows that the difference between these two conditions is going to give you the effect of the load carriage essentially, and the difference between these two conditions is going to give you the effect of the respirator. So for the statistical analysis, it'll be an ANOVA of overall performance times and the individual split times for each of the tasks that they're asked to complete. We have to determine the difference in performance due to PPE through a post hoc analysis. We would also like to run a regression of fitness characteristics to determine performance in general, as well as a regression to determine if the decrement in overall performance in each trial is dependent on different fitness characteristics. So the significance of the results, what we hope to find, it's a pretty practical application. Obviously, we can't really modify their equipment. Going through the research, they've come a long way in making the SCBA and the PPE more ergonomic and provide less of a decrement. However, if we can determine what the predictors of performance are, whether it's body composition, age, aerobic, anaerobic capacity, upper lower body muscular endurance strength, or perhaps lower body power, most of these are modifiable factors. So it's essentially like running a needs analysis like you would for any other sport to determine what their training program would be. So we're hoping that the results of this would allow academies and fire departments to prioritize their training to meet the physiological demands that they're actually exposed to during their occupation events. So at my references, I have a video of a combat challenge which would show basically what we're proposing to do. Give me a minute.
Pass already if you can get the video.
You can talk about that.
Okay. So this is the Kaiser sled. So that's about a 75 kilogram weight that he is lifting.
That's really good.
And
Takes
this
some
is
people about 25 to 30 minutes.
our favorite
That was me.
firefighter. This is Dr. Abel running through the course. So I'll leave this down on a little bit, just so you can tell how hard he's actually working. It's just pretty hard. So this would be like an equipment hoist.
I think that was about 45 pounds. I was training for triathlon. I wasn't lifting at all, so just let me preface this performance by saying I had very little strength. This announcer no longer works for the Firefighter Combat Challenge.
Yeah, this announcer gets out on some tangents.
Yeah, it's Yeah, do you want to see? If you don't do it just right, you get a handle where the sun don't shine.
I just confound your students. Act out.
I think we can all recognize that Dr. Abel is a pretty fit person, and I was surprised the first time I saw this because I was like, why isn't he burning? Why is he taking so long? But when you think about the weight of the gear, and now that I've learned about all the effects of the gear he is on, it's a lot more respectful. Supposed to be a big drag.
Is that 75 kilograms? Yeah.
Let's just play out. Yeah, let this play out for a second now. I tried to do my educational bit, so it's good for students to hear this.
Are you gonna vomit?
Train functionally and train for the test that you're going to perform, and this just reiterates the type of training you need to do to be successful at it. So, excellent course. Thank you. Thank you.
See, this is all for your presentation. Circle there, you know.
It does give a lot of appreciation for the one study you showed where they did 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off, because I think you said they were walking at 3.1 miles per hour with 5% grade. I mean, that's
With that equipment too.
yeah, that's pretty tough.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that too is I'm sure they did that because the reality is you go in a structure fire, your bottle, it's a 30-minute to 45-minute bottle, most are 30-minute bottles, but that means it lasts 10 to 15 minutes when you're actually working with a 30-minute bottle, but then you go into like a rehab tent and for a little bit, and then you go back in if you're fit for duty type thing. So it was interesting that they kind of did those multiple bouts with about 20 minutes of recovery. I think they were trying to simulate that aspect of it.
Too, looking at their heart rates during that, while there was a significant difference with heat and dehydration and everything, it's still, they had to be pretty fit. If they're doing that for 20 minutes and I think their heart rate was 156, 158, or 152 up there in the hydrated state.
And you can see too in the stress that their resting heart rate never really gets near where it was when it started. So most of them stay between like 80 and 100 even during recovery.
So I have two questions. One, has anybody looked at like how much experience plays into the SCBA? So like if someone's like a first year firefighter versus someone's like about to retire, they've been doing this for 20 years, does that change ventilation or?
So,
Is there a certain time whenever it quits having an effect, how long you've been doing it?
I don't think it ever stops having an effect, but most of the studies either use people who are not firefighters at all, so you're looking at like basically a familiarization effect and they're not used to it, versus people who have been on the job for about 7 years, just like the average I've seen experience for firefighters. The only study I've seen kind of similar to that when I was looking at one of the heat stress studies was that they have shown that over time it seems like veteran firefighters have less of a thermal response to the heat, so they seem to like over time adapt to that. But I haven't seen anything looking at like somebody in the first year versus.
And I assume that's why you're using all recruits. Is-
Yeah, and to reduce any like skill effect as well.
If I can just add on, that's a really good point, Ryan, and it's something we should look into, how much they'll be using the respirator before that point.
Yeah.
Typically, I think the influence of the breathing on the respirator with what you're talking about is, I don't know that it's as much of an effect that you can control during exercise because of the physical demands, of course, but it's like if they're in an emergency situation, a structure falls on them, they're pinned, and they only have a certain amount of oxygen left. If someone's got to come in to rescue, and they send in a rapid intervention team, so they're taught to control their breathing in that state while they're essentially sitting there, arrested or whatever the case might be. But I don't know during exercise. I think there's some control of it. Sometimes the firefighters, they can actually turn this purge valve, which will create a free flow of air, and it affects their performance. And that's something that we need to control and not allow them. They like to cheat a little bit, I've found. You go watch them and all of a sudden they get a free flow, and it has an effect.
One thing that came to mind for me was like you're planning to do this to see if like the SCBA has an effect on a certain variable, right? So what if you find out later down the road it does have an effect on recruits that aren't used to the machine, but if you're a veteran firefighter, then it doesn't really matter anymore. So we're looking to like save firefighters that are currently firefighters. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Well,
It's just an idea.
no, I understand what you're saying. I think that even like the studies that have found the decrease in VO2 max to almost 15% are still like current firefighters. So I'm not sure that it ever like, it's not something you can completely adapt to or they'll ever go away.
Sorry. You talked to us a lot about the importance of core temperature and how that can affect aerobic capacity, and also it causes decrements in performance. But I'm not seeing that you're going to measure core temperature in your study design. Do you think that that's something important? Because how will you, if you see no difference,
Right.
is core temperature going to play a role in their decrements in aerobic capacity?
So we have like tossed this idea around a lot. We've even looked into the option of using like a heated ambient environment and looking at core temperature. But so far in the studies we've seen, this test will only take them between like 4 to 6 minutes. And when you look at like point by point data for core temperature, it doesn't seem like there's really a noticeable increase in core temperature until like past 20 minutes. Like if you saw that 3-hour trial, like even that increase wasn't until close to the second hour that it became significant. So based on the literature we've seen so far, I'm not sure that it's a long enough period of time to justify using core temperature.
If I can follow it up, what was that? See, you mentioned that one study used thermal sensation. That was like a subjective scale, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was basically like RPE, but for heat, so how hot they felt they were basically in the climate. So
Probably a good idea to use, if nothing else, to try and get a subjective control, and you could go back and maybe, use it as a covariate or something.
And then I would suggest, since this is your dissertation, to do like a skin fold measurement or anthropometric measures rather than just VIA, just get a more accurate measure of body comp. Yeah, since you have them there, might as well get it.
One of the interesting physiology things about this is the SCBA, that they have to actually exhale forcefully to breathe. Normally that's a very passive task, right? Our inspiratory muscles work concentrically to inhale, to expand that chest volume, and exhale is primarily a passive task. So have you looked at maybe measuring like expiratory capacity or expiratory power as a covariate of some of your performance values?
I hadn't really thought about that.
And
but
maybe
that's a
maybe
really
even
cool-
in training intervention, we could actually like train people to work concentrically on the exhale to see if you can improve performance in these tasks?
I've seen a couple of studies, people started using like the elevation training masks, either just
Mhm.
sitting or during exercise to see what sort of impact that has on performance. I haven't seen anything. There was one study released that was Firefighter specific, but I don't think they measured any spirometry, so that's a good point.
Yeah, I know that like sleep apnea machines have a positive pressure that you have to blow out against.
Mhm.
So like, could you hook firefighters up to one of those and increase their performance? You know, sit around with one of those on and they're
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, like the
Yeah.
asthma.
Maybe. Definitely need to do a check.
Yeah, it's related to your design here. You don't have really have a balanced design, so why don't you have a PT SCBA group? And would that tell you anything? Add anything to the study?
So we originally had 5 conditions in our study. We had the PT, SCBA, and then we had talked about either a thermal condition or looking at like the weight of load carriage without the microclimate. But when we talked to the recruit officer at the fire department, he was basically like, I can only give you like an hour. Like it was very limited, even to the point that for our strength measures, like we really wanted to get some absolute like, muscular strength, like 1 RM, and he was like, I'm not comfortable doing that. So a lot of the studies done so far is coming out to just limitations placed on us by them. But it is a good point, like we're hoping that the combination of the 3 will allow us to see the effect of the respirator when added, but in an ideal situation yet.
What's the mass of the SCBA alone? So if you did it just SCBA, you're adding quite a bit of weight there.
4 kilos.
Yeah.
It's half the weight is the SCBA.
So it's 25 pounds total. I think that the pack truck, each one said it was so the pack itself was about 11.7 kgs and the SCBA was 12 when